So hi everyone, welcome to our LA County Library virtual event, Take a Tour of Late Victorian Era Los Angeles. I'm your host, Biz Tanner, and I'm a librarian with LA County Library. After its first period of major growth ended with a financial downturn in the 1870s, Greater Los Angeles entered its next boom a decade later with the completion of a direct transcontinental railroad, the lure of an attractive climate, fertile soil, and a range of opportunities. By 1900, the city and region were becoming important as a crucial hub of the American Southwest. Today's program features Paul Spitzzeri, museum director of the Workman and Temple Family Homestead Museum, who will take us on a tour of late Victorian era Los Angeles, as seen through images from the Homestead Museum's historical photograph collection. We are pleased that Paul is here to share this fascinating local history with us today. If you have any questions for our speaker, please share them in the chat found on the right side of your screen. I will be moderating the Q&A with him at the end of the program. Please let all panelists, so if you have any questions, please address them to all panelists. That way, if you have any technical difficulties, my colleague Ernest can help you resolve them. Last but certainly not least, if you're interested in seeing more of our upcoming virtual library programs, please visit our virtual programs page at lacountylibrary.org/virtual-programming. And now I'm going to turn the time over to Paul. So Paul, take it away.
All right, thank you. Thank you to the LA County Library System and the people involved for setting this up. And it's a great pleasure to be back here for a third go around. We are talking about late Victorian era Los Angeles, which will be about 1880 to 1900. The Victorian period actually goes from 1840 to about 1900. So we were talking before we got started here about the next one taking us back to the earlier Victorian period. And the images you see on this title screen here give you an idea of what we're going to do. This won't be obviously a comprehensive tour, all aspects of life, obviously, but we're going to try to give you as much information as we can about a wide variety of things that were happening in the city. So I've got my pointer here. So whether it's just looking at the development of the city up here in the top left, for example, or about the economic aspects like the citrus industry, what people did for fun, the leisure, going to the beach, for example. In our case, at our museum, talking about the Workman and Temple families in that context, and I'll give you a little bit of that history as well. But there's also a lot of forgotten or stories that aren't told as often as they should. So, for example, the Asian community, these are Chinese workers at a home in Pasadena, or what happened to the Californios, the Spanish-speaking Californians. This is Don Pio Pico, who had been a governor at the end of the Mexican period, was still alive into the mid-1890s. And so a lot of those stories don't often get told as they should. So hopefully you'll enjoy our trip. And if you were here for the 1920s, we started off with a slide of people hopping into a bus to get a tour. Well, since we're going back into the 19th century, we're going to start with people climbing into their surrey or their carts or their carriages, a variety of vehicles. This looks like a family here. So you got maybe dad out in front and mom with the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 kids in the car. So we're going to do the same thing. I said car or cart, and we're going to hop in our vehicles and take our tour through the end of the 19th century in Los Angeles. We'll start in LA, and this is a photograph actually from the 1870s. So as the introduction noted, there had been a first boom or period of growth that started just after the Civil War, lasted into the middle of the 1870s. And then there was a national repression and there was a state economic crisis, and Los Angeles went through a bust, as all these booms do. And so we'll maybe talk about that at a later date. But this photo does show some interesting things. First of all, this area of Los Angeles we're looking at is off of Main Street. The Plaza, the historic center of Los Angeles from the Pueblo period and under Mexico and Spain, is off camera. I don't know if that was intentional, but it literally cannot be seen, as if they were trying to show what was happening, what was new coming in. You don't see too many adobe buildings in this picture. There may be one here and there somewhere, perhaps up here, but mostly newer structures, brick and wood. Up here, the new Los Angeles High School, which was completed in the 1870s. So I think the photographer was trying to show the new developing part of town. But between about 1875 and 1885, there was not a ton of growth. There was some. The economy was kind of moribund, not a lot of activity happening, and that would all change with the introduction of a new railroad link to the east that was brought about by the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railway, often just called the Santa Fe, which came down through Cajon Pass at the end of 1885 with their own line to San Bernardino, and then they leased track from the Southern Pacific, which was the existing local major railroad, so they could have access to LA. End of 1885, you can see here a photograph from around that time, lots of vehicles parked next to rail cars. This is the business side of it, but also tourists could be coming in the train, as well, obviously, as new arrivals, that is, residents, migrants to the area. This is the La Grande station the Santa Fe built, a beautiful structure in Los Angeles. And so these are where folks will be arriving as you get into the later Victorian period. It's not an accident that as soon as this line came into being, a new boom came about called the boom of the 80s. It really peaked in 1887 and 1888, and we'll go through some of that as well. But there also, it's worth pointing out, remnants of the older city that were still there. So the emphasis was always on what was new. And we were talking before this started about how little remains of the Victorian era today. And of course, that's also a function of Los Angeles tending to focus on what is new. So Bunker Hill, for example, being an area of big Victorian mansions at one time, that whole area redeveloped in the 1950s, 60s, and so forth. So even in the late 19th century, people were documenting what was old. In fact, this photograph here in the upper left is actually titled "The Old and New of Los Angeles." So what they're showing are adobe structures from perhaps the mid-19th century, perhaps earlier than that. But if you look through the pepper tree up here, one of the big mansions up on presumably Bunker Hill. So they're kind of giving you a peek in the background of what would be new in the city when this photo was taken, roughly, again, 1880s, 1890s. Sonora Town, which was the area north of the plaza, primarily occupied by Latinx residents, that would be an area that was still there. It was starting to change quite a bit, though. You had more people coming in who were Italians, for example, Eastern Europeans, other working class people, because the Southern Pacific had its stockyard, or its rail yard, pardon me, right next to that area where the Los Angeles State Historic Park is today. A little bit to the southeast of the plaza, the community that was settled in this street area called the Calle de los Negros, or Negro Alley, as it was called by Americans, or another term was used by the more racist of those people. It was actually named for a dark-skinned Latino person, probably back in the 1830s. But the Calle de los Negros became the Chinese community when those folks started to come down in the 1860s to help build railroads and establish their own small community here. There was a massacre of 19 Chinese males in 1871, right where this building here is on the left. Well, in the 1880s, that was all cleared out. This became the extension of Los Angeles Street that then turned into Alameda, just about at the end of the block here, Union Station being off to the right as you look north in this photograph. The plaza itself had actually been maintained pretty well into the late 19th century. It had been a bare piece of dirt with a brick water storage tank in the middle of it. And there was some gradual movement to beautify it, as you can see in this photo from, again, about the 1880s, 1890s period, and including some trees that were planted by a member of the Workman family, Morton Bay figs. You can see a couple here. This one on the left fell just a couple of years ago. Fortunately, nobody was in the way as it toppled over. The other three are still there. But in this period, the park was there, it was being utilized, but this was no longer the center of the community. Things have been moving to the south, off to the left of the camera. By the way, behind this tree that had fallen recently is the Pico House Hotel, if you know that, just off the plaza. What was new, as I said, was heading towards the south. This is a photograph on the upper right taken from the Temple block, which is today where Temple Street meets Spring and then goes into Main. LA City Hall is on the spot where this photograph was taken. You're looking north. The plaza would be off back here in the distance, the Pico House Hotel. With this tall building this year, the Baker Block that was built in 1884, a symbol of the new emerging Los Angeles, bigger buildings, more ornate, for professionals to have their offices in. US 101 runs right through that section today. And so it's, again, an illustration of where things are heading. Further down Spring Street, maybe another block or two, probably closer to 2nd, you're looking north again, maybe the late 1880s, and you can see how busy this activity is. Lots of vehicles in the street. You can see the electricity has come in since the early 1880s. and a lot of new activity happening, telephones and so forth. So good illustrations photographically of how much things were changing. A little bit further afield from downtown, there is also a lot of emergence of new sections of town. So they're heading to the south and a little bit to the west in many cases. This top photo was a reprint from the 1920s of an earlier picture. And so it's what says looking southeast across Pershing Square. It wasn't called that until 1918, 1919, after the First World War. And General John Blackjack Pershing was a hero of the American war effort in Europe during the First World War. So they named the park after him. It had been called before that Central Park, sometimes called 6th Street. And the view is from up in Bunker Hill. You're looking basically to the southeast. And if you know Pershing Square today, of course, it doesn't look anything like the park you see here. The Biltmore Hotel basically stands right where these houses are, off to the bottom right. You can see open space just to the south. St. Vincent's College is in this area back here. At that time, it's now Loyola Marymount University. So you can see it's pretty much a residential neighborhood in the later part of the Victorian period. Another view here shows you a mixture of both residential and commercial. You can see some taller buildings and signs and so forth. This is the tower of City Hall, which was on Broadway in those days, but Broadway was called Fort Street because there had been a fort on Fort Moore Hill very close to the plaza. So again, some illustrations of how the community is starting to expand outside of the old plaza, moving to the south and southwest for the most part. Relative to those hills, there was a long period of time where nothing was really being done up there. It was just beyond the ability of early builders to do much. But when you start getting into the 1880s and 90s, you see a lot more activity. On the upper right here, this is Temple Street, which began as just a one-block dirt road in the 1850s, and they just gradually pushed further and further up on the hills. This area today is where you have a lot of the public buildings, the Superior Court, a Hall of Records, that sort of thing. So you're making your way west up Temple. Off to the right here was a horticultural pavilion where they used to have displays to talk about the agriculture and also the horticulture being done in Los Angeles, but a newly emerging residential area at that time. So pretty fun to see some of these pictures. Over here is the Bradbury Mansion. Louis Bradbury was a gentleman who made a lot of money mining in Mexico, came to LA during the 1880s, built a fantastic Bradbury building on 3rd Street that has been used in a lot of movies and gets a lot of attention, a unique architectural specimen for our area. The Bradbury community, a little city out in the San Gabriel Valley, was also named for him. He owned that property. This was one of the more exuberant Queen Anne homes of the period up on the Hill and Courthouse Streets, which would be, again, a little bit to the west of the old plaza area. This is 3rd Street. And so if you look at this photograph where this home is, right off to the right is a stair that went up the hill. That's where Angel's Flight was later installed. And Angel's Flight came in 1901, literally the end of the Victorian era. And so you had large Victorian mansions up again on the hill, Bunker Hill area. And that would all change much later on. But you can see how this was kind of the upper class location at that time. Later, you had the wealthy moving down towards USC and eventually out in the west part of Los Angeles. By the way, I saw a question pop up on chat. I can be interrupted at any time to answer any questions, so feel free to break in.
Paul, we had a great question here about the residential community near Pershing Square. They wanted to know, why was the community there replaced with other buildings? What happened to the inhabitants?
Well, it's inevitably what happens is the more people come here, the more demand there is going to be for business. And so the land values just skyrocket and become a lot more valuable for commercial purposes, not residential. So that's what's going to happen is people who are living in homes in these areas are going to sell out because developers are coming and offering them substantial amounts of money for their property. And they're going to go move down to West Adams, near USC, a little bit to the west of downtown where Westlake Park, which we'll see in a moment, is going to develop. So people, and then to the east side too. Boyle Heights, for example, actually had a upper class clientele initially because it was an area that was being expanded away from downtown.
One more question just came in. Was Olvera Street around during this period?
It was. It had been known as Wine Street because there were winemakers who had their structures, their winemaking capacity and storage there, mostly Italians, incidentally. And then Agustin Alvera, who had been a prominent Californian from the 1830s onwards, had been a judge in the early American era. When he died in 1876, thereabouts, the city renamed the street for him. Alvera Street was not well maintained as time went on. It was not until the late 1920s that what became really tourist attraction and homage in some ways to the early history of Los Angeles was developed. Okay.
We had one more question actually, and this is pretty interesting as well. So someone asked they said when Dodger Stadium was built, those homeowners were moved as well. And they wondered if that also happened to Victorian era residents. So is that sort of what you're talking about here where
Yeah, the difference there, I think, would be that that project, Dodger Stadium, was done at a time when obviously there were big commercial pressures, not just the baseball owner, O'Malley, but others who were supporting him on this, who were really pushing to have this done. In the Victorian period, there was a lot of open space, a lot of new areas to develop and grow. So that wasn't really so much a problem. What you would have in older residential communities, like I mentioned, Sonora Town, which had been primarily Latino, that you would have new people coming in the late 19th century, but not necessarily a wholesale displacement of people. What happened to the Spanish speakers is they just got outnumbered. So their community did not grow demographically. Birth rate was not keeping up with the immigration rate of other people. So that's more or less how that happened. Now, the one community that really did get displaced during that time were the Chinese. I mentioned the Calle de los Negros earlier. I showed that picture a little bit before. And so this is an example. And so they got moved to the east side of Alameda, and that's where the second Chinatown developed. But in the 1930s, when they were building Union Station, they moved the Chinese community to what became known as China City, and that's now the Chinatown that we know today. So that would be probably the one displacement of people for a particular purpose, which was to redo this street and then move the Chinese over across Alameda. Okay, so as I was starting to say, actually, there were outlying areas of the city where people were starting to move. So this is maybe a good follow-up to that question. So if people are getting offers to sell their homes on Main and First or Main and Second, where the business community is starting to move, they may go out to a place like Crown Hill. So this would be west of the 110, south of the 101. Belmont, the Belmont Learning Center would be in this general area. And later on, they would find the oil not too far to the right of this picture and the oil fields that developed in the 1890s. But this became a residential neighborhood. Second Street, climbed the hill. There was a streetcar that went through there. And so that was an example of moving a little bit further afield. Here to the upper left, this is the area of Figueroa. Ellis Avenue is basically, I think, 14th Street goes through there. So you're talking about a little bit south of where Staples Center is and all of that. And you can see it looks like a wide open residential community, like a suburb. And so over time, especially in the early 20th century, you'll start seeing that change dramatically too, and more business buildings, hotels, that sort of thing coming into that location. On the bottom left here, this is the place known as Cole Grove, C-O-L-E Grove, and that was later known as Hollywood. And this was basically a farming community in the late Victorian period. And so the dreams of celluloid and film stardom and all that are way off in the future when this photo was taken, again, probably in the 1880s. Now, part of the growth, too, is going to be in locations where you have developers who are looking for ways to give enhancements to the community. So this is a picture of a home that's still there on Figueroa, not too far from USC. It's called the Stimson House, a Romanesque revival home. It looks like a big blocky kind of castle. And so that area really began to become an upper class area because of its proximity to USC. It's not too close to downtown and all the noise and the vehicles and all that sort of thing. So another reason, of course, for people to move out of a downtown is they don't want to deal with those kinds of things any longer. So in this general area, you've got people like Edward Doheny building in Chester Place, which is a little bit to the north of the Stimson House. The Longstreet residence, which was on Adams, basically east of the 110, is another example. So very wealthy people living in proximity roughly to USC. This was an area that was considered to be not particularly good for building because it had a lot of alkali in the soil. So it was decided to establish a park here, and it was known as Westlake. But what that did is, for those areas that were outside of the lake, it gave developers an opportunity to promote access to a park, and that would drive the values up, and people started to build nice homes off of Westlake, now called MacArthur Park. Now, if we leave kind of the residential part of it, it's also worth mentioning, as I talked about USC, that there is a lot more happening in Los Angeles at the end of the 19th century with institutions. So you have things like higher education becoming a lot more important. These are the class members of 1892 at the University of Southern California, which did not have a national reputation at all. People probably didn't know about it outside of Los Angeles back then. It was affiliated with the Methodist Church, by the way, directly affiliated. That changed in the early 20th century. Occidental College was started during the boom of the 1880s, 1887, thereabouts. It was actually started, well, it was called Boyle Heights, but was slightly over the line in what would now be East Los Angeles. It then moved up into Highland Park and eventually to Eagle Rock. And where the Los Angeles Public Library, Central Library is today, they built a normal school. This was a state school for teacher education. And so that also opened up. And again, you'd get your bachelor's degree, basically, or your certification to be a teacher if you went here. So a lot happening just in terms of higher education. To give one example of what could be changing in a place that's becoming a bigger city. Public buildings also. Again, this is during the late 1880s, 87, 88, 89, when this big boom was taking place. So you have the building, I kind of pointed out before, this is Broadway, known as Fort Street until the boom of the 1880s, and City Hall was built at that time. And for that time, it was considered to be a pretty substantial building. They probably thought it would last for a long, long time. It quickly became too small for city purposes, and it took until 1928 to build a new City Hall. But it's fun to see the streetcar, to see the electric power lines, to see horse-drawn vehicles and that sort of thing. The federal court building. So investment more from even the federal government is taking place. The federal government did not do a lot of public works like we're used to today, but it was starting to happen. And we'll see an example of that with the harbor as well. But this is the federal court building, pretty impressive structure. And then the local county courthouse was built in 1889 up on the hill. Temple runs along the north side, Fort Street or Broadway here, running through one side of it. And so it's an illustration of how there's enough money now and interest, and it's a point of pride to have a substantial courthouse. Usually your courthouse, your library, your high school, those are some of the key indicators of how much a community invests in what it wants to do for public benefit. And so this structure, long gone now, but that was a much bigger improvement on the courthouse they had before, which is a much smaller building. So economically, there's a lot of commercial development going on. And to go back to that question before, there was a very impressive home here on the left of this photograph. Isaiah W. Hellman, who was an early Jewish immigrant from the early 1850s, became a merchant as a teenager, showed incredible ability at what he did, even had a little bank, informal bank in his store, became a banker, ran farmers and merchants for many years. His home was situated in this corner. I believe it's 4th and Main, and it wasn't going to last there because, again, the values were too high, and so they would either sell out and move somewhere else, or they may convert their home into a commercial development. His brother Herman did that, where his house was, 3rd and Spring, I think it was. He tore his house down and built the Herman W. Hellman commercial building on that spot. This is the Van Nuys building, which was one of the more impressive commercial structures of that late Victorian period. This was a little bit to the north, and this is the Temple block. So I showed you a photo earlier from that building looking to the north. Now we're in front of the Downey block, which is at the northwest corner of Main, Spring, and Temple, looking to the south. But again, still a prominent commercial district. This is down towards, I believe, 2nd and Main. In fact, this is the streetcar that went to Crown Hill that I mentioned earlier. So just some examples of where you can see commercial development coming in. I do see more questions popping up, so feel free to interrupt. No, this was not
question came in about
go
the Ellman. How did the Ellman family spell their name?
Oh, it's Hellman, Hellman. Related to the mayonnaise people, that was spelled differently. But the Hellmans were here from the 1850s onwards, prominent in banking especially.
And then another question, and I'm not entirely sure which building this is referring to, but is that building still there?
Well, let me go back and see if somebody can,
if you want
put a thing in the chat.
yeah, pop it in the chat and tell us which building you were curious about.
Yeah, if it was a commercial one, it'd probably be more like some of these here. So like one of these are all public buildings. None of these are here. I don't think any of these are here. Van Nuys maybe, come to think of it, but LA City Hall stands where the Temple Block was located. All these buildings, this 5-story one back here up to here, that's all City Hall today. This one is long gone as well. Yeah, there are some, but there are not very many that are left in that period of time. I was just going to say that in the late Victorian period, heavy industry is not really there yet. By the very end of the 1890s, you start seeing some meat packing coming in. There had been a mill, Capital Milling. That building still was in the Chinatown area, and some small ironworks. You start seeing people like Baker Ironworks, for example, starting to come in, but not the big industry you'd see starting in the 1920s, but a lot of smaller enterprises. So just some examples, a carriage works here. This guy would do all kinds of machine work. You had a big bustling area, the produce market. So this is a good example. This is the wholesale produce market at that time. When you got into the 1920s, you'd have a much bigger produce market. This is basically in the same area that you see today, east of Alameda and west of the river, that sort of location. And of course, lots of small proprietors of markets and smaller businesses going on in that era. But one of the big changes in the early 1890s was the very sudden discovery of oil very close to downtown. The oil industry got its start in the 1860s in what was called the San Fernando Oil District. It's the mountains west of I-5 as you start heading into Santa Clarita, close to Six Flags. And some success was found up there in the 1860s and 70s and afterwards. And then a couple guys show up from New Mexico area, Edward Doheny and Charles Canfield. They had been mining out in New Mexico, had done okay, Canfield especially. But when they got to LA, they had a very crude, pardon the pun, little apparatus to drill for oil up in these hills, just basically where Temple goes up towards the 101 and the 110 intersection. And Doheny and Canfield hit it big, and they opened up the Los Angeles oil field. I'm glad you like that pun, thank you. And so this became a residential neighborhood. You can see there's houses tucked in here and there in these forests of derricks. And so this is another example of why people would not be living in a given area of downtown, because it's just too valuable for oil prospecting, and who would want to live next to the noise and the smells and the danger of oil wells bursting and gas and that sort of thing. But this became a huge success early on, and Doheny wound up going into Orange County at the end of the 1890s and bringing in the first oil field there at Olinda in what is now the city of Brea. So I was referring a little bit to government investment, and in the early 1870s, the federal government gave the first allocations of funds to do some improvement at what was called the harbor. It wasn't really a harbor, it was just a landing point. In the very early days, ships literally had to be out past Dead Man's Island way out here, anchor offshore quite a bit, and then bring smaller craft into the shore to do the trading and that sort of thing. And so what they wound up doing is building a breakwater in 1871 to make it better conditions for accessing the harbor. By the 1890s, they decided that there was going to be a competition between San Pedro / Wilmington and Santa Monica. The Southern Pacific had a long wharf out here. There had been a smaller railroad that was built in the 1870s called the Los Angeles and Independence that got to Santa Monica. The Southern Pacific took it over and then built to the north this long wharf. And what they were hoping to do, the Southern Pacific, was to draw all of the shipping to their port here rather than at San Pedro Wilmington. So both factions and their supporters lobbied Congress really hard in what's called the Free Harbor Fight. And San Pedro Wilmington won out. and got the federal investments to be able to make the early stages of what we now know as the Great Port of Los Angeles and its sister over in Long Beach, whereas the Southern Pacific decided they were going to tear out this wharf because they had lost that battle. So again, illustrations of how a lot of things were changing even close to downtown. This is not too far on the upper right here from Maine and Jefferson. So you're basically talking South Los Angeles, just below the 10. And you can see how agricultural it was, how rural it was. That was going to change very quickly. In fact, I think this photograph was taken as the owners were getting ready to tear all this out and subdivide and sell it. There was a similar thing with the Wolfskill orchard. Look at these orange trees. This is a gentleman who's probably about 5'8", 5'10", whatever the average height would be. These were enormous trees. William Wolfskill was a Kentucky trapper fur trapper who had been in New Mexico and then came to LA in the 1830s. He planted the first commercial orange grove in California in 1841. They were still there 50 years later. Massive trees, just attesting to the fertility of our soil. But they had to go because it was just too much pressure to develop for industrial and commercial purposes. He had a beautiful adobe home on the property with lovely gardens in it, and that was all sold and raised and turned into commercial property, mostly in the 1890s. So anybody who's involved in real estate, like this guy here, Ben Ward, his next door neighbor in this building was a real estate agent. His name is Dunlap. This happens to be an old adobe structure that was the courthouse. Believe it or not, in a relatively small adobe house. It had been City Hall at one time. In back of it was the city jail and county jail for a while. That was gone too during the late Victorian period. Just examples of how much things were changing. Now, there were attractions to talk about for leisure, so I thought I'd bring some of that up too. This was called Washington Gardens. It had actually been developed in the 1870s period. It was off of Washington Street and Grand, that area. So it was considered to be out in the suburbs when it first got started. It was in the country where you could get away from noise and smells and activity and enjoy the big grape arbor, and they would have band concerts and that sort of thing. Over time, Washington Gardens turned into Schutz Park, which was kind of like an early example of an amusement park in the early 1900s. And so it had a long life as a kind of a leisure area under different names. This is Hollenbeck Park in Boyle Heights, and you can see how undeveloped the area was when this got started. Hollenbeck Park was a major attraction for people on the east side who would enjoy leisure out there, and this is just one of the early photos of that, early 1890s. I see more questions popping up, so feel free to, again, to bring up.
Sure, there's a couple that came up. One was about the Doheny building that you were referring to. They said, is the Doheny building at USC named after the same Doheny you're referring to? And I'm guessing yes.
Yes, and Edward Doheny's house in Chester Place, which is just north of USC, is part of Mount St. Mary's College today. Yeah, absolutely. Doheny.
And then another.
Go ahead.
Oh, sorry.
It's okay.
I'm so sorry, Paul. And then another question that came in was something about the Santa Monica Railroad. It said, where was that Santa Monica Railroad? What's there now?
It's a good question. Is it the Expo line, the train that runs from over to that area, Santa Monica, that uses the right of way of the Los Angeles and Independence Railroad. So the depot for that was 6th and San Pedro, kind of southeast of downtown, and then it ran basically westward out to Santa Monica. But some of that trackage right of way is being used today by whatever, I keep forgetting the name of that metro line that runs through there today. Yep.
Another question came in, any info on Main Street or El Monte Lions?
Gay's Lion Farm, that's the question. Yeah, that would be a much later development, 1920s. So yeah, not from this period. But there were, I'll actually show you some photos of kind of earlier examples of that. So there were animal farms that were starting to come in by the end of the Victorian period.
And then we had a few people who said it's the Expo line. So I think you were right when you said it was the Expo line.
Yeah, and then the colors. It's always hard to remember the colors, but yeah, the Expo line. That would be basically a lot of the right of way for that would be that old railway.
And then there was one more question regarding early industry. Did the Pacific Art Tile Company in Tropico have much of an impact in terms of new jobs?
Well, some of those that would be coming in, and I don't know exactly when that started. I'm guessing probably if it's the very end of the 1800s, maybe the early 1900s. Yeah, to some extent, Gliding McBean would be a good example of that because of building and construction. And then people who are wealthy who might want to have ornamental work done on their houses, that sort of thing. So sure, that would become much bigger as time went on. Not probably as pronounced in this era as you're going to see in the early 20th century. But definitely you get some examples of it. Stained glass windows too. So Judson Studios, which is still in Highland Park, I think that opened probably in the early 20th century, maybe just after the Victorian period. But it's, again, tapping into the growing market for ornamental decoration for architecture.
And then there's a handful of other comments and questions. And one was about a picture of a semi-tropic market, and they wondered if that's where the semi-tropic bar is.
Oh, I don't know. That's a good question.
Yeah, I don't know.
It's probably that one here back when we were looking at the this one here. Whoops. Yeah, I don't know. One way to probably tell is to look at newspapers and see what we can find about the Earl, which I'm guessing is probably the name of the residential hotel or something that was on the upper floors of this. But yeah, that would be. But semi-tropical was pretty popular as a title because that referred to the climate of our area. People used to say semi-tropical, Southern California, and that sort of thing.
And then, sorry, one more question. Lots of curiosity about sort of transportation during this era, and someone was wondering, when did Union Station? When was that built? Did it exist during this era, or was that later?
Much later. What happened was that the two main railroads at the time would be the Southern Pacific and the Union Pacific. They both had their depots in close proximity to each other, basically off Central Avenue or on Fifth, that location. And there was talk about a unified station early in the 20th century, but there was a lot of pushback from those railroads as well as other people. And so it wasn't until the 1920s that there was a big movement to build a Union Station. The Depression came along. It didn't open until 1939, but they were planning for that probably back in the late 1910s.
Fascinating.
Okay, awesome. Well, just again, some other attractions. I've already shown a photograph of this. This is what they called 6th Street Park, now Pershing Square, but you can see how beautifully ornamented it was, the flowers and the trees and all that. Now, it's also important to remember that the clientele for this are wealthier Caucasians who are living in this area. So as communities change ethnically and racially, as well as social class, those parks aren't going to be maintained as well as they used to be. We can see that in many examples throughout Los Angeles. But in the 1890s especially, there was a parks boom. There was just a ton of interest in developing a lot of the major parks we have. And again, this is, I believe, East Lake Park maybe. Elysian comes in during that period of time. Griffith is a little bit later, but not too much later. Smaller parks like St. James. So the city was willing to invest money in that. But again, these were in neighborhoods at the time that were primarily upper class Caucasian residential communities too. So if you're in Sonora Town or you're living in downtown LA, an industrial area, and you're a working class person, you're not going to have these parks in your community. That's just not going to be the case. And then there's private and semi-private landscapes too. There was a big interest in landscape and horticulture during this period. Again, mostly private, although some public parks. So this is the garden of the Longstreet family. Some people think this was a general from the Civil War. It's been stated a number of times in different places. It was not. It was a shirt-tail relative or a distant cousin who bought some property, died, left it to his wife, and they invested a ton of money, many thousands of dollars, in building a beautiful horticultural area. This was the approach to their house off of Adams Boulevard, with these palm trees. And over time, as the Longstreet sold it and got subdivided, it became kind of a community of exclusive homes. Today, I think it's Children's Hospital is on this property, and some of these palm trees are still there. So you can actually go to Google Maps and see through certain views that this road's still there and the trees are still there. So that's kind of cool. And this is the garden of the station for the Southern Pacific, their depot off of Central. So they invested a little bit too. And so if you're a tourist or you're a migrant and you hop off the train and you see the beautiful and unusual specimens that you would not see in Ohio or Pennsylvania or New York, that you would maybe only find in LA or other areas, that was part of the environment they were trying to create as well. Other attractions to bring up, you start seeing a lot of pageants and parades coming in during the Victorian period. The first one was called the Chrysanthemum Festival. That was for a few years at the end of the 1880s and early 1890s. That morphed into what was called, well, it had different names over the years, but La Fiesta. And so La Fiesta basically existed from the early 1890s until World War I. And so this is an example of, I think these are all young ladies, maybe from Los Angeles High School, I think from a school somewhere in the city, dressing up, getting in their carriage filled with flowers and all that. They were also trying to tap into what was happening in Pasadena, because at the same time you had the development of the Tournament of Roses. This is a photograph from 1897, and the floats and the vehicles, of course, pale in comparison to what we've had in recent years, although not this year, of course, for one of the few times in its history. But they were starting to get a lot of activity in Pasadena through the Tournament of Roses, and LA wanted to try to capitalize with its own La Fiesta. So they're happening sort of in competition with each other. Even things like serious music, so-called serious music, classical music, you start seeing a lot more of that happening. You'll have the development of a symphony orchestra in the early to mid 1890s. The Philharmonic we have today starts in 1919, but there had been for a quarter century before that a professional symphony here in the city. Live theater. There had been theatrical presentations going back to the early days of LA, usually in people's houses. There was a theater very briefly around 1860. But by the end of the 19th century, you start having a lot more touring companies coming out. They're running a circuit, and they would go to San Francisco, and sometimes they would just go somewhere else, not come to LA in the early days. But by the end of the 19th century, there's a big enough population and enough interest to support live theater. This is a photograph of an actress. She had a picture taken here. She might have been somebody traveling with a company and stopped and had her photo taken. But you see some illustrations of how things are starting to change with culture and the arts. So you start having an art school at USC not too long after this. And these are some illustrations of how things are beginning to really change there. So people asked about Gay's Lion Farm. So that didn't exist back then, but they did have ostrich farms. This is a big craze at the end of the 19th century and well into the 20th. There were several of these. There was one at Lincoln Park called Eastlake Park at this time. There was a couple down in Orange County and Norwalk, those places. This was called, in this picture, the South Pasadena Ostrich Farm. It was owned by a man named Cawston, C-A-W-S-T-O-N, on the border of South Pasadena and Los Angeles, and very popular with tourists. But Cawston made money because he could sell the feathers and kind of create a market for selling the products of the ostriches. But people would love to go to places like that, and it was off the streetcar, so it was a great way to be able to capitalize on that. There was a guy from Norway who was a Mormon and a polygamist, and he left his many wives in Utah and came down to LA at the end of in the early 1890s, and he opened up a pigeon farm that was located basically where the Arroyo Seco meets the Los Angeles River, right off the Elysian Park. Another pretty popular place to visit. I would imagine you'd have to hold your breath for a lot of it, probably pretty nasty olfactory wise, but it existed for almost 20 years from the 1890s into the 1910s. But there was a flood that destroyed it as the Arroyo Seco and the LA River came together. But these are examples of some unusual attractions well before you would have an LA Zoo. And then later you'd see things like the alligator farm, the lion farm, Selig Zoo, which became Little Park Zoo. It's done for motion pictures, that sort of thing. But before all those, you had some early examples like this. And as LA began to grow and attract more attention, they decided that they could market themselves better. The LA Chamber of Commerce became a very powerful marketing tool for the area starting about this time. This is a horticultural fair that was held here, so it was local, but they were able to build upon that. There was a big exhibit at the World's Fair in Chicago in 1893. California broadly, but also Los Angeles County drew a lot of attention to the area. Mainly through things like the orange culture, raising of oranges, but lots of other things as well. So there was a big movement to publicize and promote LA, climate, fertility of the soil, open space, lots of opportunities, at least for some people. Regarding transportation, there's another big change as well. There had been a single horse-drawn streetcar that developed in the 1870s that brought first public transit to the city. It was very simple. And then later on, you start seeing the development of cable. So this is the Los Angeles Cable Railway, which went into Boyle Heights, still a growing suburban area of the city of Los Angeles, came in from downtown. And what's kind of neat about it, if you can see on the left here, they show one of those horse-drawn streetcars and some prominent figures. You know, the horses are bucking and getting wild, and the car stops, and it was just inefficient. But here in 1889, you see the very smooth operating cable system, no animals to worry about, no stops to make, that sort of thing. So it's kind of fun how they promoted the change in just 10 years between one system to the other. And then the electric railways come right after that and totally transform. So the Pacific Electric and that era is going to be in the early 20th century. Henry Huntington shows up in LA at the very end of the Victorian period. And then shortly after that, he'll develop his massive system. But the Los Angeles Railway, which he bought, was existing within city limits to ferry people around. And that also allows for suburban development, right? Because if you can live a little further out and take a streetcar in, then it makes the commute worthwhile.
Hey, Paul, you actually just mentioned Huntington, and someone had asked a little bit ago, and I was holding on to the question for later, but they asked when he built his house. And I'm assuming that's the one in Pasadena that's so well known and is now
Right.
the Huntington Gardens and library.
Yeah, exactly.
Museum.
Yeah, Huntington's uncle was one of the big four, the four guys, the octopus, which means 4 times 2 arms, who ran the Southern Pacific. And so Collis Huntington was the uncle, and Henry was in Cincinnati working for the company, doing local railroading out there, and then was brought out to San Francisco in the early 1890s. And when he came out from the Midwest, he came through LA in the San Gabriel Valley. He spent some time, several days at a ranch called San Marino, owned by a guy named Shorb. And he was just, like so many people were, he was just thunderstruck by how beautiful it was here. He came in the winter. And of course, in Cincinnati, it was snowing and 12 degrees or whatever. And he's out here in 65, 70-degree weather. But he had to go to San Francisco first to work for his uncle. When the uncle died and the Southern Pacific was taken over by a powerful railroad guy named E.H. Harriman, Henry was cut loose. He took his stock and he was basically shown the door. And so he came down to LA and he invested in local streetcars, bought the San Marino Ranch, which he'd admired so much, and then built that house. But that's going to be the first 10 years, more or less, of the 20th century when that happens, just after the Victorian period.
And then there's actually a question about a photo that you just, I think it's on the slide, maybe the previous, about someone wearing a shorts. They were wondering if there was a girl wearing a short, they said a girl on the right in a short skirt. Was there a girl with a short skirt somewhere? I'm not seeing it.
Maybe the actress, her.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, she might have been in costume for whatever performance she was doing. That's what I'm wondering. Yeah.
All right. Well, thanks, Paul. Sorry.
No problem.
Lots of good questions for you.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, and just an illustration of how important streetcars were. A lot of photographs are going to be taken. They're going to show these because they want to promote what's new, what is advantageous to promoting the community. And just, again, to go back to Huntington, he eventually built the world's largest rapid transit system in terms of mileage of track. So because we had the open space for that, you can obviously accommodate all of that. But someday we'll get back to having more of that, maybe, or maybe we'll be forced to. This is 5th Street, basically kind of approaching, I'm guessing, somewhere around Springer, Maine. Off in the distance out here would be the Southern Pacific Depot, I believe. So this is 5th is your kind of an industrial area today of LA out in this section. But at the end of the Victorian period, 1897, a guy named Edward L. Erie, I think it was Edward, E.L. Erie, builds the first automobile in Los Angeles. 1897. It looks like almost like a little truck. This is Erie. He is driving around W.H. Workman, William Henry Workman, who was a nephew of the founders of our museum site. Workman had been the mayor of LA during the boom of the 1880s. He was a parks commissioner in the 1890s, founder of Boyle Heights, along with Isaiah Hellman, who I mentioned earlier, and some others. And so Erie was a Boyle Heights resident. And that's probably why he took Workman on the first automobile ride in the community. So the auto's coming, and it will eventually become the dominant mode of transportation, obviously, by the 1910s and so forth. But in the 1890s, it's a brand new thing. Also, just worth mentioning things that were changing dramatically in terms of, say, religion. So this is a predominantly Catholic community up until the 1870s. And so after that, you start seeing the Protestants take hold. The boom of the 80s brought a ton of people from the Midwest, the Northeast, and the South for that matter. So whether it's Episcopalians or Methodists or Presbyterians, you're going to start seeing a lot more of that reflected in the landscape, looking at the photographs, as you can see here. And I always love to point out, now that I see it, you look at any old pictures of houses, you always want to look for the little building in the back, maybe with a little pipe sticking out of it, because that's where you're going to go, to the outhouse. And as I used to say, the outhouse was too close in the summer and too far in the winter. So there's a good example of one on the upper left photograph. Okay, so I've given you a little run through for downtown and LA area. We're going to head out to the suburbs with these folks. It's like a double date, and out in the countryside, we're going to investigate what was going on in the greater Los Angeles area. So there was a lot of growth, not just in the city, but also in the county area. In the San Gabriel Valley, most of that was on the west end, not surprisingly, because you move further and further from downtown as you go along. Pasadena was an 1870s development from the earlier boom I mentioned. And then it really took off with the boom of the 1880s at the end of that decade. And so there were lots of broad streets with trees, again, for the wealthier folks who lived in Pasadena. This became a haven in the wintertime for people from the East Coast, especially the well-off. So Millionaire's Row was South Orange Grove Avenue, as you basically go from the 134 south. And so this is not that particular street, but it's in Pasadena, and other areas were developing as well. This is Monrovia in 1887. It was a railroad boom town. The Santa Fe came through that year and through that part of the San Gabriel Valley. And so Monrovia popped up, named for a guy named William Monroe. And this is a sale of lots. And you can see it's a pretty crowded group of people. So during a boom, people get excited. Sometimes they buy land sight unseen. It was not uncommon for people to buy property from the east, not even coming out here, and then finding out it was in the middle of a riverbed or a creek or a bad location. And so they're shysters as well as legitimate real estate people. But this is a great little photo of the early days of Monrovia. But for the most part, San Gabriel Valley was pretty rural still. This is Alhambra. And in that time, there was the city of Alhambra. It was also initially started in the 1870s as a place called Lake Vineyard. It died out when the boom went bust then. And then the boom of the 80s came and it was reconstituted as Alhambra. They were obviously playing off the Spanish associations with Southern California. This is a little bit in the outskirts of that community. This is a place called Old Mission. I wanted to point this out because the San Gabriel Mission's original location was in the Whittier Narrows, where the San Gabriel River and Rio Hondo kind of go through the little wedge between Montebello and Whittier. And there had been a little community out there. So this is a member of the Temple family from our museum site. Her husband ran a saloon and a pool hall and all that. So a lot of the San Gabriel Valley was still rural. And some of the folks who had been around for a long time were living in these older communities. San Gabriel had not changed much either. The mission town was still pretty small in the Victorian period, although the mission became a greater and greater tourist attraction as time went on. We'll talk about that briefly too. So in the outskirts, it was still primarily agriculture that was predominant. We had been known in the early days for cattle, and there had been a drought during the 1860s that really put a crimp on that. A lot of cattle died, first from floods and then from drought during the 1860s. There were still some cattle being raised in the San Fernando Valley and down in southern Orange County, places like that. Grapes too were pretty big at one time. There were a lot of vineyards in the Los Angeles area. We were the prime winemaking region of California for a while until Napa and Sonoma came along. But there was a big disease called Pierce's disease. It was brought by a small insect, and it rapidly made its way through the area, starting in Anaheim and just devastating throughout Los Angeles. The only area that was untouched for some reason was Rancho Cucamonga and Ontario. So this photo was taken out there during the later Victorian period, late 1880s probably. So that was the sole place left. But a lot of Italians who raised grapes out there, like Wasti and others, would have their products sent into Los Angeles to be basically packaged and shipped out. There was still some ranching activity. This is a creamery and deli, D-L-A-H-I, kind of like in India. And this is now part of Santa Ana. So that whole area was still very much rural and agricultural back in those days. San Fernando Valley, as I said before, I don't think these photos come from there. In fact, this one on the bottom is from Irvine. This is the Irvine Ranch, James Irvine #2, with his farming. These guys may be out in the San Fernando Valley, come to think of it. Look at the mountains back there. But in any case, the San Fernando Valley was pretty much a broad expanse of wheat fields for a lot of the 19th century. And then when water came in, you're going to start seeing the big development of that area into the 20th century, but primarily agricultural. There were a few towns like San Fernando had started in the 1870s during that earlier boom. Some good examples here of the predominant agriculture, though. We were known, the orange was kind of the symbol of Los Angeles until Hollywood came along. And so if people knew this area at all, it's because of the immense quantity of oranges. This is Santa Anita Ranch, which was owned at the time by Lucky Baldwin, a very colorful character of the time, a nemesis of sort of the Workman Temple families. He had acquired the Rancho Santa Anita back in the 1870s during that first boom. He turned it into a show place, raising thoroughbred racehorses as well as the agriculture. So it says San Gabriel. That was kind of the general designation. Later became, of course, Arcadia. This one on the bottom, I think, is in Santa Ana. And again, Orange County got its name for a reason, right? It was the big producing area at that time as well. What's really notable here is that I'm guessing this is either the foreman or the owner of the grove, but most of the laborers on inspection look to me like they're Chinese. And this is probably, again, around 1890. So a lot of the labor was being done by Asians. And there had been an Exclusion Act in 1882. So there were no more immigrants allowed basically into America from China. So these guys had to have been living here for a while, probably before they went into that line of work. As that community started to diminish in population, the Mexican Revolution, for example, comes along in the early 20th century, then you start seeing more Mexican labor being done in these groves and fields. And because the orange was so big, this is a packing house in Pomona in the late part of the 19th century. So I'm trying to get different areas of the county here. You start seeing a lot of promotion. Look at this big mission bell made out of oranges. This might have been, in fact, one of the exhibits for the World's Fair in Chicago in 1893, come to think of it. And so it was a huge enterprise. One of the big achievements at that time, a young man named Edwin T. Earl, I think he was only in his mid-20s, he came up with a refrigerated boxcar concept that really revolutionized the ability to transport oranges long distance. Earl later owned the Los Angeles Express newspaper, became a prominent resident of the area. And I mentioned oil before in Los Angeles, just some examples of outlying fields. So this is in the general vicinity of the Puente Hills near Whittier. In 1885, a member of the Rowland family discovered oil on his part of the Puente Hills. And so that was another major field that opened up. This is Olinda, I mentioned earlier. Doheny opened that up in northeastern Orange County at the end of the 1890s. So oil becomes a much bigger part of the whole enterprise. And railroads benefited because they were moving to oil as their fuel supply from the earlier examples that they had. All right, a little bit of leisure in the outskirts too. This was a very popular attraction from the early 1890s until the Depression years. The Mount Lowe Railway. Thaddeus Lowe was a fascinating character. He had done a balloon corps during the Civil War for the Union Army, came out to this area in the 1890s and came up with this idea, this amazing funicular railway. You would go up to these upper elevations. They had, for example, here is the Alpine Tavern that he built. So you could spend time there with a couple other places like that. A big attraction. Henry Huntington wound up buying that about 1900 and tied it into his Pacific Electric system. It wound up lasting until the Depression because the economy and there were floods and other problems. It wound up shutting down. This is a very early development, probably the end of the 1890s, up near Mount Wilson, one of the camps. So the great hiking era started in the 1890s. About 40 years, people just flocked to the local mountains to do hiking, camping, hunting, fishing, that sort of thing. It was just a very popular time for all that. A lot of those camps wound up being wiped out by fires and floods. And of course, we're seeing examples of that just very recently up in Big Santa Anita Canyon above Arcadia. It's just, again, some other fun photographs of people enjoying the great outdoors back then, including stagecoach rides that you could do in places like San Gabriel Canyon above Azusa. A lot of these folks would have pack mules take themselves and their goods from the lower elevations up into the mountains. And some of these photos are a little bit later than the 1890s, but they hadn't changed much in terms of what people were doing. And here's a good example of a campsite with the women wearing full-length dresses and that sort of thing, out working, and the men are out hunting or fishing or laying around, whatever they're doing, letting the women do all the work. And again, the beach is also very popular. The idea of surf bathing was not necessarily something people did a lot in, say, the 1870s, but by the end of the Victorian period, you start seeing more people enjoying the water. Surfing's going to be a little ways off. Duke Kahanamoku has to come over from Hawaii in the 1910s or thereabouts to introduce that. But there's definitely more activity going on. And so these beach areas that had not been developed that much prior to 1880 really start to become very valuable. This is Santa Monica, the Arcadia Hotel, which is a big landmark there. Further south at Redondo, that became a big development during the boom of the 1880s. Long Beach started again about that time as well. So those were kind of the key beach areas. Some other examples. This is Santa Ana coastal area. So I think the photographers from Santa Ana, this is probably down at Corona Del Mar, Laguna Beach area, and they're out camping with their tents. So there's no formal resort, there's no hotel. It's more roughing it down that area. Catalina Island, which had been privately owned for a long time and actually had been the site of a lot of mining in the 1850s, 60s era, was bought by the Banning family. The Bannings owned a lot of the transportation networks at the harbor. Wilmington was founded by the Banning family, and they owned Catalina during the Victorian period. It was mostly tents, some wood frame hotels, not as fully developed as would be later on. Up here in the top right, this conical little outgrowth was later bulldozed and blown with dynamite and that sort of thing when William Wrigley, who owned the island after 1919, built the big casino there that we know today. But a nice view of Avalon, which was a tourist attraction in the late 1890s. Long Beach, so a lot of development there. The Pike would come later on. There were big plunges. I think this is a plunge here. So there were saltwater pools indoors next to the beach. So that's what I was saying. People sometimes prefer to swim indoors in a saltwater plunge rather than go and face the waves, which can often, of course, be dangerous. And this, I believe, yeah, this is the Redondo Beach Hotel. So good examples of some of the resort activities going on at the coast. So as we wrap up, I always like to again mention stories that are passed by during these periods of time, because there's so much going on with new migration, new building, new institutions, new ways of doing things, that a lot of the earlier stuff gets bulldozed very quickly, and the people tend to get forgotten. So there are a few examples of Californios, for example, Spanish speakers who had been here since the late 18th century, in other words, the 1700s, and their descendants who were still around, but not necessarily as prominent. So Pio Pico, this is a photo of him during the late 1880s. And it was said that as he aged, because he lived from 1801 to 1894, almost the entire 19th century. So imagine all those changes from this little village of a couple hundred people or whatever it was when he was born to tens of thousands. It was said that as he sat on the porch of his Los Angeles house, because he had lost his ranch to a swindle in the early 1890s, that people would drive by, tourists would drive by, and the driver would say, "Oh, there's one of those old Californios. That's Pio Pico. Used to be a governor, like he was like a relic as part of a show." There were only a few people who maintained some public role from the California community. Reginaldo del Valle is one of those. The del Valles owned a large rancho called Camulos, just outside of LA County and Ventura County, near Santa Clarita. But Reginaldo was a member of Congress, a prominent politician, but one of the very few. There weren't a lot of Californios who had public roles any longer during this time. A lot of the Latinos who were in the area were either recent migrants, or they had maybe been longstanding, but they were working in occupations that didn't get photographed very often. So it's pretty rare to find pictures of just workers in a field. I showed you one of an owner showing off his oranges, that you might see, but to find just workers posed. This is on the Workman family property in Boyle Heights. I showed William H. Workman in the car earlier. This is his ranch before Boyle Heights became really developed, some of the laborers there. When he ran for mayor, incidentally, in 1886, people pointed out that he hired Chinese, and that's why he shouldn't be elected mayor. And he had his ranch foreman say, "Well, I only did that because I couldn't hire anybody else. White men wouldn't dig ditches and do the hard work, so I had to hire the Chinese." It's just fascinating to read those stories. And a lot of these photos that were taken, this is a personal camera from the 1890s. This is the Kodak 1A. You had to have some money to buy these cameras, and someone decided to take a picture of a Latino family in front of an old adobe house, maybe to kind of capture a relic. A lot of tourists were looking for that. They'd come out to see the crumbling missions or old adobe buildings and take pictures. "Oh, see, I found something from the old days of California." Same thing here. This actually, I think, was a commercial photograph. But why it was taken, I don't think these folks could have afforded to have a photographer come out and take their picture. I suspect it was taken as a way to show people what old California looked like. What you sometimes saw were pictures like this, though. This was labeled on the photograph Cholo Camp. And by Cholo, they're talking about migrant workers from Mexico who are coming up seasonally from Mexico, or maybe they're coming from other parts of the Western United States seasonally to do labor. And I'm not sure exactly whether this was taken somewhere in LA, but you can see the tents all and set up and all that. These are very rare to find. People are often invisible, but even the use of the word cholo, it just really stands out. The Chinese too, they were often only seen either at the La Fiesta parade when they would bring out their 500-foot long dragon, and people would, be in awe about it and be attracted to it, interested in it. But as soon as that parade was over, the Chinese were largely forgotten. Sometimes tourists would go down to Chinatown and snap pictures. We have some where people are hiding their faces because it was actually offensive to the Chinese to have some stranger walk up to them, as you could imagine, and bring out a camera and take a picture. These guys in the back, it makes me wonder if they're kind of trying to avoid being photographed as well. This is Ferguson Alley, which is basically where Union Station is located today, that general location, plaza spot. So it's kind of hard to find any images at all, but they're out there once in a while. This is obviously a Chinese vegetable peddler being photographed. I mentioned this before, a couple of workers at a home in Pasadena. So probably a well-to-do Pasadenan with his laborers, household workers. African Americans, it's very difficult to find really any documentation at all. There was a small community that had cropped up starting in the 1850s in the area. Biddy Mason, a very prominent woman who lived until the end of the Victorian period. She was brought as a slave from Utah. She was owned by the Flake family at one point. Jeff Flake, the recent senator from Arizona, is a descendant of that family. And so the Owenses, the Masons, other families maintained a small community for quite a long time. This is a photograph of a float in the La Fiesta Parade. There are African Americans here. I don't know why. I would love to know that. Might have been a Methodist Episcopal Church, AME Church float, who knows. This one was actually labeled The Men That Painted the Derby, and there's a black man in the middle of it, and it just stands out because you can see all white workers here, and he's just wearing different costumes. So I'm not sure what the situation with that is, but whenever you can find photos, it's kind of hard to get these images of people back then, of different racial groups. Women too. The story of women can often be a little bit tricky to nail down. So you might find women working as nurses, as this one is here, or teachers, and you might be able to get documentation that way. This is a great one of a young woman with the Salvation Army. And so there was sometimes employment for the charitable causes. But again, these are mostly going to be middle class, upper middle class white women who be documented this way, not necessarily with the teachers per se, but you're going to find occasional references to other things like women's clubs. So this is a pretty impressive mission revival structure, maybe a little bit later from this time period, but women's clubs start to become a big thing in the Victorian era. Again, mostly upper class white women. A lot of them working with settlement houses for new immigrants, Latinos, Eastern Europeans, Asians, who are moving increasingly to the area. And of course, that's causing a lot of concern about the big migration of people from other countries who are not American. And that leads to immigration laws in the 1920s. This is a women-generated structure, kind of a rare example. This is called the Temperance Temple. It was started by women who were affiliated with the temperance movement, the Women's Christian Temperance Union, WCTU, often Methodists. And so this was a building that was basically planned and paid for by women in this organization. Temple and Broadway, I think, is where that was located, somewhere around there. I think the courthouse is behind the photographer. Okay, last part of the talk here is about the families at the Homestead Museum, so you can learn a little bit about us if you don't know much about who we are. We are located in the city of industry. Up here is Valley Boulevard as you go over towards La Puente from El Monte. And we are located just a little bit south of that. This is what our property is today. At least we have about 6 acres of it left here. And it was once part of a 24,000 acre ranch. It was reduced to 75 acres, as shown on this map, because of a bank failure. The Workmans and Temples owned one of the early banks in LA during that boom of the 1870s. They were not very good at it. Unfortunately, their managerial skills were lacking. The bank got into financial trouble. They borrowed money from Lucky Baldwin, who I mentioned earlier, and could not pay him back when their bank failed. So they had just a small part of their ranch during the late Victorian era. One of the Temple family owned it when this map was done in 1880. He was a winemaker, had a lot of vineyards, as you saw probably in that map. I can go back to that. So there's vineyards here at the bottom next to this creek and some orchards as well. And then by the time he died in 1888, we had the Pierce's disease and the grapes were gone, and his younger brother, John, inherited the property. John struggled after that. The 1890s featured 6 years of drought as well as the National Depression. And he got into financial trouble, borrowed money from a bank, couldn't pay it back, if that sounds familiar, and lost the property in 1899, just at the end of the Victorian period. I just saw that comment. Yes, these guys like to pose with dramatic Napoleonic touches there, which I thought was pretty impressive. Francis never married. He was given a leap year proposal, if you know what that is. Every leap year, women were allowed to propose to men directly and formally, and he was asked to marry one leap year, and maybe told her to take a flying leap because he didn't get married after that. This is John and his family at the Workman House, which we still have at our museum. So someday when we're open again, hopefully by the fall or whenever that's going to be, you can come visit and see the museum. We still have this building today. There were other Workmans, though, who were living in Los Angeles. One of the Workmans owned this home in Boyle Heights, pretty impressive little building, no longer there. His cousin was the man I showed you earlier, William H. Workman, who was the mayor of LA and founder of Boyle Heights. This is his residence. These were off Boyle Avenue on the bluffs overlooking downtown Los Angeles. There are still a few Victorian era homes on Boyle Avenue, just not these particular examples. There's a Japanese retirement home on this corner where these two buildings were located, 4th and Boyle. And this is William H. Workman, the mayor of LA during the boom of the 1880s. Parks Commission in the 1890s. He became city treasurer for the first 7 years of the early 20th century. And I'll just mention quickly that his older son, Boyle Workman, became president of the LA City Council in the 1920s, very actively involved. And his sister, Mary Julia Workman, one of the few women to have a public presence. She worked in settlement houses. She had been a teacher, but she also was on the Civil Service Commission. She did a lot of work with labor, anti-war efforts at one point in her life. She had a very interesting civic life, charitable work, and so forth. So that is your whirlwind tour through the greater Los Angeles area during the Victorian period. Again, I hope we can come back and take you back to the 1860s and 70s and show you more about that. So as we disembark from our trolley cars here, thanks for joining us. This is our website, homesteadmuseum.org. We've been talking before the presentation about our female justice series. My colleague Jenny Trulock is doing a presentation about Amy Semple McPherson and her mysterious disappearance in 1926. You can register by going to that. We have an active blog, almost daily posts, homesteadmuseum.blog. And this is our tag. You can follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter using @HomesteadMuseum. And with that, I'll turn it back over. And thank you all very much for listening.
Well, we had some really, oh wait, I just realized my camera's not on. My apologies. We had some really great questions, but we are way over time. So thank you all for your questions. Hopefully we'll have Paul back again. We should just honestly do a Q&A with you, Paul, because people have so many great questions.
Let me do this too, if I can. I'll go to chat and then maybe I can put my email. Can I do that real quick?
Yeah, you're welcome to do that. And while you're doing that, I will go ahead and just sort of close things out from the library end of things. So thanks everyone for joining us for this Take a Tour Through Late Victorian Era Los Angeles program. I hope you've enjoyed it as much as I have. Paul is always a good time. Find more virtual library programs in our weekly virtual programs e-newsletter and on our virtual programming page on our library website, lacountylibrary.org. For the latest library news and events, please follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at LA County Library. We hope you stay safe and have a wonderful rest of your day. So thank you so much for joining us.